So now we're going to begin our discussion of cultural values. And as I mentioned in the last lecture, these are not intrinsically right or wrong. We're not talking about good, bad, moral, immoral, biblical, unbiblical. Okay? Any of these values can be applied or misapplied according to biblical standards. And so we need to keep that in mind. And I'll try to give you along the way some biblical examples, perhaps, of the way that these are used. We go into a lot more detail about cultural values in cultural anthropology class, but this will at least whet your appetite for studying these fuller. The first one is what we refer to as identity, and it asks the question, who is important here? Now, two key terms here that identify the difference in cultures are the terms collectivism and individualism. Now, let me just say, and this pertains to all of the cultural values, there is no culture that is totally one or totally the other. There's not a purely collectivistic culture, and there's not a purely individualistic culture. All right? Every culture is a blend of that to some degree. But certain cultures are largely collectivistic and others very individualistic. The individualism really stands out in the Western world. Now, when we talk about the Western world, remember we're talking about North America and Western Europe. Most of the rest of the world is what we call the two-thirds or majority world. And by and large, that two-thirds world is collectivistic in its outlook. It's the West, North America and Western Europe, that emphasizes more individualism. And no country is considered to be more individualistic than the good old United States of America. In fact, the Cultural Revolution that's going on right now that says you can be whatever you want to be, nobody can tell you that you're male or female, and you can be male today, and if tomorrow you change your mind and decide you're female, nobody has a right to challenge that. That is what I would call individualism on steroids. It is the extreme application of individualism. And collectivism is quite the opposite. Collectivism says, I get my identity from within myself. From within the group. Collectivism says it's the community or the tribe or the country that really makes that decision. Back when the Boston Marathon bombing took place, the uncle of the two perpetrators was interviewed. Of course, he was innocent in the whole thing, but he was willing to give an interview regarding his sons or his nephews. And in that interview, he actually calls out to them and he says, turn yourselves in. He says this, you have shamed our family name. You have shamed our people. You've shamed our country. What was he doing? He was explaining to them and to those who were listening that it was a collectivistic impact on the family, the community, the people, the nation, and not just the guilt of the two nephews that mattered to him. Americans, when these guys were caught, celebrated the fact that justice had been served, and the focus was on the two perpetrators themselves. So there's a lot to be said about this. It's a very different reality. Now, I mentioned that there's no such thing as a purely individualistic or purely collectivistic society. For example, in the United States, where individualism is championed, you will also find collectivistic entities. The biggest one would be the family. You've probably heard the phrase, blood is thicker than water. In other words, family ties often cause people to do things that they might not normally do because of the relationship of family members. Take sports for an example. If some of you have played sports, team sports, you may have experienced the scenario where you lose a game, you walk into the locker room, and one of the players says, man, I'm sorry, I lost that game for you guys today. And what does the coach do? Right away, he says, no. He says, there's one thing you need to understand. We win together and we lose together. That is a collectivistic idea. Okay. Yes, there's individual responsibilities. We give most valuable player awards, okay, most improved player awards, things like that. Those are individualistic characteristics that you might not find happening in some countries. But but collectivism is more the idea that it's about the community. Some of you may have studied Maslow's law or Maslow's pyramid, and it shows some of the important elements of life and humanity. And you may remember that at the very top, the ultimate goal in Maslow's pyramid is self-actualization, becoming what you as an individual can become. That works in an individualistic society, but it would never work in a collectivistic society, because in a collectivistic society, it's not self-actualization that is meaningful, but social harmony. What is best for the group? What helps us to maintain unity and peace within the group? That's what's important. Now, in the scriptures, you find both. You find collectivism in the analogy of the body of Christ. Christ is the head, and then you have the arms, the legs, the fingers. Remember, and Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and in Romans chapter 12, the importance of the unity of the body of Christ. That is a collectivistic idea. And yet at the same time, the Bible defends an individualistic outlook when it says each one will give an account for himself before the Lord someday as to what was done in the body, whether good or bad. Each one of us must give an account of himself to God. That is an individualistic idea. So both of them are present and need to be considered. Again, there's so much more to say about collectivism and individualism, but that at least gives you the basic idea. Now, the second cultural value deals with authority, and it asks the question, who's in charge here? Right? Fascinating to think about. And if you've ever worked a job that involves a group of people, then you have seen this in action. And we identify the two extremes here by referring to high power distance and low power distance. And high power distance is typified by the illustration on the left. You can clearly see who's in charge by the figure of the tall person there. The other three very clearly inferior. In a high power distance culture, you'll never have any problem identifying who is in charge. In a classroom, in a meeting of the management of a company, or in a political scenario, because sometimes the very way that the leader dresses is distinct from everybody else, or the place where that person sits or stands is very distinct from everybody else, and everybody knows that person's in charge. In contrast, low power distance seeks to minimize the distinction between the leader and the followers, the employer and the employee. You may see the boss intermingling with the employees of the company and not even be able to tell who's the employer and who are the employees. If they're sitting around a table having a meeting, a company meeting, you may not be able to tell which one is the CEO. The way he dresses or she dresses and positions him or herself is almost indiscernible from the other people. Now, there are reasons why cultures are high and low power distance. And again, this requires a lot more time than what we have. But let me just to give you a couple of thoughts here. In a high power distance culture, a lot is invested in the leader to make decisions. The subordinates are not trusted when it comes to the large decisions that need to be made, the big moves that are made in the company. And so all of that is entrusted in the leader. And the thought is, if the leader doesn't make the decision, then fragmentation and division could take place if everybody's given an opportunity. And the respect for the leader may be diminished, and he may lose control of the company by allowing other people to approximate his position in the company. So you see this in churches. In high power distance cultures, the members of a church will not question the authority of the pastor, very seldom ask questions that in any way suggest that they wonder if maybe he's right about a certain doctrine or not. You wouldn't do that. In a classroom, a student would not feel free in a collectivistic, in a high power distance culture to raise his hand and say, could you please explain that a little better? I didn't understand what you said, because that would be to demean the authority of the teacher. And so if they don't understand something that's said, they wait until after class, they talk with one another, or they locate a student that seems to understand everything and gets all the good grades, and they get their answers from that student. So it's a very different reality. In a low power distance scenario, the idea is, why should we waste all of the knowledge and the contributions that fellow employees can make? In other words, the CEO says, man, I got people who are smart. They know this business, and they may have some ideas that I haven't thought of. And why should I rob our company of all the resources that are represented around this table? And so, you encourage them to contribute because it's for the good of the company. Or in a classroom, a low power distance teacher would say, one of the best ways for us to learn is to allow the students to participate. It keeps them on their toes. It keeps them thinking. It may even challenge some of the other students that are a little bit more lazy in their study habits to kind of get on the ball when they see their colleagues. In other words, there's a positive peer pressure going on here. And so that's the idea of the lower power distance. And so you can see that there are benefits in both approaches. A pastor in a low power distance church it really appreciates it when a member comes up after the service and says, I'm not sure I agree with you on one point you made in your sermon. Can we talk about it? He says, hey, that's great. You're thinking. I'm glad you're thinking. And yeah, let's talk about it. And he may even come to the point where he says, I think you have a good point there. And I'm going to have to reconsider, this particular part of my statement, or, what I presented in my sermon. And so it can go both ways. What about in the Bible? Which do you find? Think about the relationship between Jesus and his disciples. In fact, we can get both of these from one passage. When Jesus is in the upper room with his disciples, and he's speaking to them in John 13, 14, 15, and 16, there's quite a bit of interaction that goes on there. And at one point, Jesus says to his disciples, you call me Master and Lord, and you are right in doing so, for so I am. In other words, he acknowledges that they are correct in seeing him as Lord and Master of their lives. I mean, there is no comparison. He is way above them. That would be a high power distance statement. But in the very same meeting with his disciples, he says to them, I have called you friends. Now, friend is a very, very different kind of a statement. Friend says we have a close relationship. There's an intimacy among us. One of the things that's often lacking in a high power distance relationship is intimacy between the leader and the followers. Low power distance creates more intimacy. And so in the very same meeting with his disciples in the upper room, Jesus says, I am Master and Lord over you, but I am also your friend. Isn't that amazing? It's an absolutely amazing. Abraham was called the friend of God, and yet he trembled at the presence of Abraham. Moses was one with whom the Lord spoke face to face, and yet he was told to remove his shoes at the burning bush because he was standing on holy ground. So the Bible presents both of those. It's kind of like the father-son relationship where the son reveres his father's authority and fears what happens if he disobeys him. Yet at the next moment, he's rolling on the floor, playing with him or throwing a ball with him. just like he would with his buddies. And so that's the high and low power distance. And again, much more to say about it, but I hope that at least it helps you to gain an appreciation for how this sort of thing functions in society.